The scouting business is a highly important part of building an NBA roster. You want players who are not only excellent prospects, but who also fit into the identity of your team. The comparisons and projections on draft day are always incredibly fun to read and talk about. However, sometimes the scouts and writers just go off the rails and give us comparisons that are simply absurd. In this video, I want to take a look at some comparisons that were way off from what these players ultimately became. I'm gonna look at both ends of the spectrum, guys who were projected to be way different than what they turned out to be, for better or worse, and using DraftExpress.com and NBADraft.net as my sources. How's it going, folks? My name's Andy, and without further ado, let's begin. Kwame Brown, Chris Webber / Karl Malone. Now, most number 1 picks have absurd expectations to begin with, but a lot of times, other consensus number 1 picks like Anthony Davis, Tim Duncan, LeBron James, Shaq, they more or less met or exceeded their expectations. And unlike Anthony Bennett, who most people didn't have much faith in to begin with, Kwame, however, you can tell he was expected to be a great player, a generational star. The results were quite the opposite, in fact. Right from the start, he did not have it. He didn't have the work ethic or the drive to get better or any of the skills that he displayed in high school. That's the risk of taking high school players. It's not just the uncertainty of their games translating over, but their mindset and their maturity. Very few high schoolers lived up to their hype. Karl Anthony Towns, Andrew Bogut. Now, Bogut wasn't even a bad player. He was a great center for many years, but this comparison is absurd because Towns turned out to be a completely different player than Bogut. While Bogut was a defensive-minded center, Towns is an offensive dynamo, and his biggest weakness for most of his career has been his defense. They have like completely opposite skill sets as centers. However, this comparison was made because Towns' defensive prowess is what stood out in college. So I guess the scouting reports on draft night back in 2015, it kinda made sense. Towns was one of the best defenders in the NCAA, and he did a lot of the dirty work, so that's where this comparison came from. It was quite unexpected when Towns became this good offensively, which makes this comparison look ridiculous in hindsight. Eddie Curry, Shaquille O'Neal. Talk about aiming high. Continuing off the high school craze back in 2001, Curry was one of the best high school centers the world has ever seen. But Shaq? Really? I guess the only thing they had in common was they gained a lot of weight throughout their careers, but unlike Curry, Shaq actually dominated when he was heavier. Pascal Siakam, Jordan Mickey / Luke Mahmoud. I literally had to look up who Jordan Mickey was. Apparently, he was a 2015 second-round pick who spent 3 seasons in the NBA as a bench warmer, but in recent times, he's been dominating in the EuroLeague, which is cool. For Siakam, a first-round pick to get compared to a bench warmer, talk about low expectations. Safe to say, he surpassed him quite quickly. In fact, Siakam's 4.2 points a game in his rookie year was more than what Mickey averaged in any of his 3 seasons. Of course, afterwards, Siakam blossomed into an all-star and all-NBA player. Also, I feel like there's no basis behind the Luke Mahmoud comparison, besides the fact that they're both from Cameroon. Donovan Mitchell, Norman Powell. Powell is a good player. He had some solid seasons, but this comparison is just way off. I can't imagine anyone looking at Mitchell on draft night and thinking, oh, this guy reminds me of Norman Powell. Especially since, keep in mind, at the time this comparison was made, Norman Powell was averaging 8 points a game, and he was the 46th pick of the draft a few years prior. Even if he showed some flashes, as a youngster, Powell was a huge question mark, and struggled to crack consistent minutes. Now, Mitchell, being the 13th pick, why would you even compare him to Powell? Almost immediately, this comparison seemed ridiculous when Mitchell hit the ground running. Some years later into their NBA career, and now Mitchell has become a perennial star and exceeded way beyond that initial projection. Ben Simmons, LeBron James. Whenever you compare a player to an all-time great, especially LeBron, you automatically assume he's going to be a generational talent, at the very least. Simmons, being the first pick, being compared to not just LeBron, but Magic, a taller Jason Kidd. He was compared to all sorts of legends. There was an aura, a mystique around this 6'10" point guard. And in his first couple seasons, he showed so much promise. It's just he never showed he was capable of reaching that next level. Whether it's his mindset, or his lack of drive, or his lack of improvement and motivation, these things separate Simmons from the upper echelon of NBA stars. Mason Plumley, Yijian Lian. The absurdity of this comparison is at a whole new level. Yi was drafted in 2007, and he was quickly recognized as a major bust. Plumley was drafted 6 years later in 2013. In what world should you compare a player to a bust? That certainly won't make Plumley feel any better. Did they expect Plumley to flame out of the NBA very quickly as well, just like Yi? Perhaps, but it was just a weird projection. Marcus Smart, Dwayne Wade. So Smart's pre-draft scouting report was a lot different than the player he turned out to be. In college, Smart was a much better scorer, a great slasher, he drew a lot of fouls, was a poor three-point shooter, and they were both 6'4", 220 pounds. Basically, everything about Smart reminded people of Dwayne Wade. So, in theory, this comparison made sense based off his college career. The results, though, were far different. Smart, for most of his NBA career, has been a very poor offensive player. At this point, he's more of a catch-and-shoot player who struggles to run an offense consistently. If Smart panned out how we thought he would from what we saw in college, maybe he could have been similar to D-Wade. Adam Morrison, Larry Bird. Ah, yes. Back in the day when pretty much every tall white guy who can dribble was compared to Larry Bird. Morrison, though, was certainly the most extreme example of this. Not just that, but Morrison turned out to be a complete bust. Despite dominating at Gonzaga, nothing he did translated to the NBA. But seeing him play at Gonzaga, he was so freaking good. It almost made it seem like this comparison to Larry Bird was legit. If you've read his scouting report by Aaron Smith, man, he made it seem like he's gonna be an all-time great. It was almost believable that he could be the next Larry Bird. In reality, all of his weaknesses were accurate, but none of his strengths. Andrea Bargnani and Darko Milicic, Dirk Nowitzki. Yes, similar to the previous comparison, but this time it's about the tall Europeans who can shoot. They all get compared to Dirk. Bargnani had a much better career than Darko, obviously, and at the time of their comparisons, Dirk was approaching his prime. He was already widely regarded as the best shooting 7-footer in NBA history. While Bargs and Milicic showed incredible skills prior to the draft, it's always dicey to compare guys to all-time greats. Damian Lillard, Jared Bayless. This is another comparison that boggles my mind. Now, I do understand that Lillard was very underrated coming in. There hasn't been a single player to come out of Weber State and have a successful career until Lillard came along. Still, when he was about to get drafted, Bayless was a fringe role player, a backup point guard who was nothing special. I guess the similarity was they were both considered score-first guards who were not true point guards. But very quickly, Lillard rose up the ranks and became a bona fide star, while Bayless remained a backup point guard for the rest of his career. Giannis Antetokounmpo, Nick Batum. I don't blame the scouts for getting this wrong and for not having faith in Giannis. When he came in, he was a huge project. He was lanky, weak, he didn't really have many skills outside of his physical tools. Most project players never reach their potential. The Nick Batum comparison was mostly due to, people thinking he could be an all-around forward who could do a little bit of everything. Nobody thought he'd grow into this powerhouse of a player. And finally, Deshaun Stevenson, Michael Jordan. This has to be the most absurd comparison I've ever read. It was so absurd that the original writer of the scouting report made an apology for comparing Stevenson to the great Michael Jordan. Not to mention, he was merely the 23rd pick of the draft. His report was mainly based on his high school accomplishments, where he averaged over 30 points a game, and he did come straight out of high school. Either way, I don't think any other comparison tops this one, and it's a great way to cap off this video. Anyway, that's all folks. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you can think of any other absurd comparisons that were way off from what the player actually became. What other examples can you think of? Let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and of course, as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.